And today we get to discuss Introduction to Social Psychology. In the book that I am using, there's actually a huge amount of modules for social psychology. It's probably the most well-developed section in the book. But right now I'm trying to do a focus on the ones that I'm going to be using most. So stay tuned. There will probably be more sections for this module, social psychology, uploaded in the future, just likely not right now. Here's your discussion question for the day. How is our behavior influenced by others, both individually and in groups? Give you a moment to ponder that. You probably have a lot of answers that you could give to this, including stuff like peer pressure, which will come in another section, in a few slides. At least that will be the joke. The joke will be related to peer pressure. So really, when it comes down to it, is social psychology is really trying to answer the question I just posed. It's the branch of psychological science that's concerned with understanding how others, the presence of others, affects our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Generally, the whole concept of groups are usually that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. You hear that frequently from Star Trek, if you're a big Trekkie. But that is frequently how people do behave. Now, that is something that we're going to discuss further. But there are also times where just one person can also influence the many. I do have, of course, somebody who did a thing from Big Bang Theory, which of course I'm going to show you, that actually includes other helpful information in social psychology and groups. I did not make that one. But we're also going to discuss later how just one person can influence other people as well outside of this clip, but I think that's in another lecture that's coming up soon.
I'm Leonard Hofstetter. I called you about the apartment.
You said you're a scientist. What is the sixth noble gas?
I'm Leonard Hofstetter. I called you about the apartment.
You said you're a scientist. What is the sixth noble gas?
Radon?
Are you asking me or telling me?
Telling you? Telling you.
Next question. Kirk or Picard?
Original series over Next Generation, but Picard over Kirk.
Correct. You've passed the first barrier to roommatehood. You may enter.
Winter morning, in the time before the light, in flames of death.
We need a truly kick-ass team name.
When the darkness is falling.
How about the Perpetual Motion Squad? It's beyond the laws of physics, plus a little heads up for the ladies.
The ladies?
Perpetual Motion Squad. We can go all night.
I like it.
I don't.
Then we could be the Bengal Tigers.
Yet, gram for gram, no animal exceeds the relative fighting strength of the army ant.
But you can't incinerate a Bengal tiger with a magnifying glass.
Let's put it to a vote.
I move that any vote on team names must be unanimous. No man should be forced to emblazon his chest with a Bengal tiger when common sense dictates it should be an army ant.
The gentleman from the great state of denial yield for a question.
I will yield.
After we go through the exercise of an annoying series of votes, all of which the gentleman will lose, does he then intend to threaten to quit if he does not get his way?
He does.
I move we are the army ants. All those in favor?
How about we go rock, paper, scissors? Anecdotal evidence suggests that in the game of rock, paper, scissors, players familiar with each other will tie 75 to 80% of the time. The number of outcomes. I suggest rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock.
What?
Scissors cuts paper. Paper covers rock. Rock crushes lizard. Lizard poisons Spock. Spock smashes scissors. Scissors decapitates lizard. Lizard eats paper. Paper disproves Spock. Spock vaporizes rock. And as it always has, rock crushes scissors.
Okay, I think I got it.
Rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock.
Okay, who gets the extra dumpling?
Rock, paper, scissors, lizard, Spock.
Okay, one of us is going to have to stop putting.
And that's an example of how just one person can influence the many. But we will actually be discussing stuff like persuasion, although I'm not sure what Sheldon did is exactly persuasion. But we will discuss more of that in another lecture that should be coming up soon. Okay, and here is your joke of the day. Sorry, this isn't nearly as good, but oh well, what can you do? So a reporter interviewed a 104-year-old man. And what do you think is the best thing about being 104, the reporter asked. No peer pressure, he replied. Ba-dum-bump. Anyway, sorry. So this here is a section about stress. This is actually a very, very common stress scale. And for those of you who might be taking my class live, and if I'm doing activities in this class, you might want to skip ahead to another slide, because sometimes I actually will use an activity based on this scale in class, and quite frankly, I'm about to give you the answer. So I'm hoping they've skipped ahead by this point. For those of you who haven't, well, stick around. So this is a very, very well-known scale about life stress inventory. This is only part of the scale. The scale actually goes on. I don't know how many, I don't remember how many sections it was, but it was, I know, a lot more than 10. And basically, this whole thing takes how many stress you've had over the course of a year and tries to predict how likely it is that you're going to have some perhaps major health issue caused by stress. If you're under something like 150 points when you look at everything, not just these top 10, you're usually doing pretty well. If you have over 300, you're more likely to have some type of health event, something like an 80% chance if I'm remembering correctly. If you are in something like in medical school, I would strongly recommend you keeping track of all of this. When I was in medical school, I had 350 in the course of 2 months, and then over 500 in the course of almost a year, and that was very, very dangerous. But so if you guys are interested, go off, find that. You can actually find it online. But if you look at these top 10 issues here, you see that we have some things here, and I want you to take a moment to count out how many of these have to do with maybe social relationships. Just give you a few seconds to do that. So looking back, I'm hoping you've answered all this. These are, like I said, the top 10 stressors, and all 10 of them involve social relationships. Some of them are obvious, like deaths like the spouse or close family member, or getting married or separated or divorced or whatnot. But those are all probably fairly obvious. Some of these are probably less obvious, such as detention or jail. That's actually due to an exclusion from society, so you're temporarily being outcast. You know, it's not to say that you don't have some social relationships in jail, but it comes down to an exclusion situation. For those of you who have had the misfortune of having some major injury or illness, you guys are aware of how excluding that can be, especially if it's something long-term and chronic. For those of you who have not had that honor, it can be very hard on the person if they can't maybe leave their room or leave their house. It can be a little challenging. Of course, fired from work, you know, that's a very obvious exclusion situation because, oh, I no longer want to work in this, the company no longer wants you and gets rid of you for whatever reason. You know, you of course probably have friends there that you probably did get along with, and this can really disrupt that friendship. Of course, there's also retirement, because now you're willingly saying goodbye to work and some of the other situations as well. This is kind of interesting. I'd recommend everybody try and reach out and actually look at the social test, because it's kind of interesting. So studying social psychology, a lot of people have this belief that psychology, especially social psychology, is not one of the sciences. And it is. It uses the scientific method just like any other science. Sometimes the experiments are a little bit more challenging, since not all of them can be easily run in a laboratory setting, depending on what social behaviors you're trying to observe. You may need to go out into the field and do what's called a naturalistic observation and see what people do. Also, sometimes things like controls can be a little bit more challenging, but people are able to work this out. In the next slide, I'm actually going to show you a video of a situation where they had to use naturalistic observation to do what's called the bystander effect, to check on the bystander effect. In this bystander effect, basically we know that people try to avoid helping somebody else if they're in a group. They also don't want to take responsibility. That's part of that whole situation. This comes from a young lady who was being murdered over the course of an hour and a half. 38 separate people heard her call out to please get some help, and nobody called the police or even tried, because in part because they always assume somebody else did it. They also said it's none of my business, it's none of my responsibility. So those types of things can be a little bit challenging to set in a laboratory setting. So we need to do naturalistic observation on that, and that's what we're about to show you.
Plays like this street in New York City. If you were unfortunate enough to be the victim of a crime or taken ill unexpectedly, you might think that surrounded by all these people, someone would intervene. After all, isn't there safety in numbers? Psychologists say no. Research suggests that often a victim is less likely to receive assistance when surrounded by a group rather than a single bystander. When people are in a crowd, it's easier to pass the buck. It's what psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility. Liverpool Street Station in London, a busy thoroughfare for commuters. Unknown to these passers-by, Peter is an actor. As part of an experiment on bystander apathy, he's pretending to be ill.
Help! Help!
How long before he gets help?
Please, somebody. Help!
Plays like this street in New York City. If you were unfortunate enough to be the victim of a crime or taken ill unexpectedly, you might think that surrounded by all these people, someone would intervene. After all, isn't there safety in numbers? Psychologists say no. Research suggests that often a victim is less likely to receive assistance when surrounded by a group rather than a single bystander. When people are in a crowd, it's easier to pass the buck. It's what psychologists call the diffusion of responsibility. Liverpool Street Station in London, a busy thoroughfare for commuters. Unknown to these passers-by, Peter is an actor. As part of an experiment on bystander apathy, he's pretending to be ill.
Help! Help!
How long before he gets help?
Please, somebody. Help! Help me, sir. Please help me.
Helping would be inconvenient or even risky. He lies there for more than 20 minutes and no one raises an eyebrow.
Please, somebody help me.
It's always very distressing to watch situations like this where people are obviously suffering and no one's actually helping them. But what we have here is two conflicting rules. One is the rule that we ought to help, and the other is the rule that we ought to do what everybody else is doing. And here you have effectively a group of strangers who are exerting the pressure not to intervene, not to help. And it's very difficult to rebel.
Ruth, another actor, takes Peter's place. How long before she receives help? Four minutes later, and 34 people have passed without stopping.
Well, people don't really want to know. They just haven't got the time. Well, they have got the time, they just don't want to get involved.
Unwittingly, these strangers have silently formed a temporary group with a rule: don't get involved. They're afraid to stand out from the crowd and won't take action if no one else does. This woman has clearly spotted Ruth, but she conforms to the rule and does nothing. Watch what happens, though, when someone else helps.
So you're now seeing an example of basically that whole, not only that in-group, out-group situation, but also that bystander effect. And it's very interesting what that last person said when they were dealing with the gentleman in the suit. You know, do you suffer from epilepsy? That's an interesting question, because I'm kind of wonder if that particular person may have had some medical background, because that's not a question that most people would actually ask in a situation like that, but a medical person might. But she was very fast on the response. This situation about this diffusion of responsibility and this bystander effect is why, if you guys ever took a CPR course, they may say something like, once you have checked their pulse and stuff and you realize you need to call 911 and maybe you can't do it because you're going to be tending to them, you need to designate a specific person to do that activity. You can, because if you say somebody call 911 or whatever, they probably nobody will do it. But if you say, hey, you in the red shirt, can you call 911? They're much more likely to do that, and help can be on the way so you can get backup. So that is an example. So if you ever see someone like this, I know it's going to be hard for you to break that norm of reaching out and just simply going, hey, you okay? It could be, something as small as that could really, help. And don't be too terribly scared of everybody else, because even if you realize they do need help, it's a few seconds to just call the police or an ambulance and go, hey, something's going on, this is my thing. You don't even necessarily even have to talk to the guy if you don't want to, but something like that, just saying, hey, can you send somebody out, will be also just appreciated, because you don't know if somebody is really having an issue or not. So social psychology has so many different subsections, and here are just 5 of many sections: attraction, attitudes, peace and conflict, which really should just be violence, social influence, and social cognition. All of these are factors in social psychology, which we'll briefly touch on in this particular lecture. As we first mentioned attraction, that was first on our list. A question to ask you, and you can take a moment to think about it if you like. But what do you find attractive? Are there certain attributes, physical, mental, or whatnot, that you are particularly drawn to? And why? Most people probably going to say some physical attributes or some emotional ones, and that's all fine. But have you ever wanted to know, why we have these preferred things, why we prefer this over that, why some people may go after blondes in the U.S. That seems to be very popular, or tall people or short people, why everybody has a type? Well, some of this comes down to things like cultural learning. You'll find this. You'll find that some people have a specific type or specific attributes that's what they really look for. Certain cultures may stress certain things over another. For example, Jews tend to really stress things like intelligence, being a little bit of a bookworm. also marrying inside the faith as well. There may be other key things that different groups also do. I can only speak for the ones I'm very much aware of. But every country really does have something a little bit different that's going on, either physical attributes or emotional, mental, or behavioral personality traits that you guys might be stressing more than others. Now, I could have gone off and showed some. There was a lovely Photoshop project by this young lady, reporter, sends her picture out to several graphic artists in several different countries, and says, "Make me beautiful." You can actually Google that on YouTube. It's a fascinating project. But a lot of people didn't really change her all that much. I mean, they did, certainly they changed her. But instead of people going to compare her to whatever normal standards of beauty that their country has, she mostly focused on, very common cultures that probably had exposure to Americans, had probably had a lot of other things going on as well. But there are a lot of other certain characteristics or attributes that different groups find attractive. So instead of doing something more common, I wanted to look at some of the more unusual beauty standards across the world. So some of them are from countries and groups you have heard of, and some of them maybe not so much. So this also will be discussed more if you guys ever choose to take an anthropology class. So there you go.
Though Western beauty standards may be taking the world by storm, they still aren't the norm everywhere. There are some cultures that take Though Western beauty standards may be taking the world by storm, they still aren't the norm everywhere. There are some cultures that take their beauty standards seriously, and sometimes it can seem a bit brutal. If you are a first-time viewer, click that red subscribe button. Prepare to be shocked with these 10 unusual women beauty standards around the world. Double tooth, Japan. Most of the time when people have crooked teeth in Western cultures, they pay thousands of dollars to get them fixed. The exact opposite is true in Japan, where women pay to have their teeth crooked. This beauty standard is known as Yeiba, which translates into double tooth in Japanese. The trend started with Japanese pop stars, but women with crooked teeth have been thought to be alluring in Japan for a while. Long earlobes. Maasai tribes of Kenya. The Maasai tribes of Kenya have been stretching their earlobes for centuries. The older the person is, the longer their earlobes tend to be. The Maasai women stretch their earlobes over time with various size horns, rocks, or sticks. Once they are done with the stretching process, they decorate their earlobes with beaded ornaments. Stretched lips, Southern Ethiopia. When a girl is becoming a woman in this southern Ethiopian tribe, they will start the lip stretching or lip plating process. Over a period of time, she and her family will keep stretching her lip until it is about 8 to 20 centimeters in diameter. At that point, the woman will put a plate in her lip, which she takes great pride in decorating. The process is also important as it is a part of wedding rituals in their culture. Elongated necks, Thailand. From the time they are 4 years old, the women of the Kayan tribe in northern Thailand start putting brass coils around their neck. As the woman ages, she gets more and more coils. Eventually, the coils elongate their neck, which is considered beautiful in their culture. Though it seems like they are growing long necks, it's actually the weight of the coils pushing their shoulders down that gives the illusion of the desirable long necks. Fat farms, Mauritania. In the Western cultured world, it's hard to believe that people would actually send their young daughter to fat farms to pump them up. That is exactly what they do in Mauritania, where being curvy and having stretch marks are most desirable. Girls are sent to camps where they are force-fed up to 16,000 calories a day, all for the sake of being able to get married. Red clay skin and hair, Himba people of northern Namibia. The Himba people of northern Namibia slather themselves head to toe in a thick clay called ochis. The ochis is made from ochre, fat, and aromatic resin. When applied to the hair and body, it turns everything an orangish red, which is supposed to symbolize blood. To the Himba people, blood is the essence of life. While this is a beauty standard, it actually serves a second purpose. The ochis also helps protect their skin from the sun and heat. Scarification, Ethiopia's Karo tribe. The ancient ritual of scarification in Ethiopia's Karo tribe seems a bit brutal, but it's still practiced today. It is a long, painful process that includes women cutting patterns into their faces and chest with sharp objects like glass or knives. Once the wounds are open, the women rub charcoal or gunpowder into the openings, so that the wounds will form keloids once they heal. Over a period of time, women can add more and more scars to themselves. They think of scars as artwork and admit that the only reason they still perform scarification is to attract men. Face tattoos, Maori. The Maori are the indigenous Polynesian people of New Zealand and have a rich and interesting culture. Maori men and women have been using face tattoos or facial moko to enhance beauty, show social status, and show personality for centuries. No two facial moko are alike, and women usually have a less extreme version than their male counterparts. Maori women usually get facial moko on their chins, and they believe this defines and flatters the face, draws attention to the eyes, and can even correct facial flaws. Surgical bandages, Iran. When it comes to beauty standards around the world, most cultures agree that noses are important, but none of them take it as far as women in Iran, which has now become the nose job capital of the world. Iranian women are born with what they believe are unflattering noses, so when women are old enough, they get them fixed. To them, wearing their surgical bandages from their nose jobs are like wearing a bandage of honor. Women will even fake getting nose jobs and wear fake surgical bandages, all for the sake of being desired. Teeth filing, Indonesia. In Indonesia, it is customary for boys and girls to go through metata, or teeth filing, by the time they hit puberty. This makes the teeth look elongated and sharp and is considered quite beautiful in their culture. The custom is said to help the soul remove sadistic urges like jealousy and anger. While people don't have to get it done exactly at puberty, it is a custom that must be done before someone can get married. What did you think of these unusual beauty standards?
So the question is what did you think about some of those? Well, some of them might seem, a little bit extreme. That's because we are looking from it from an outsider's point of view. To them, some of the things that they might see us do might also be considered a little bit extreme as well. So why are certain people attractive? Certain people are attractive due to a variety of factors, some of which have nothing to do with cultural influence. And we're going to start touching into some of those now. If you go off and take cultural anthropology, you may see more, same with sociology, as well as if you take more social psychology. So some of these concepts are that we tend to have this preference for what's called a prototype. And the prototype is basically this average look of a person. When we think, what does a man or woman look like? This concept of an average member of that category comes to mind. So the average person isn't necessarily going to be extremely attracted to the lower or the higher end people, but are certainly going to be more likely to be attracted to the average people. People who think about might remember stuff like Bill Clinton. He's not a really attractive dude. He is fairly symmetrical, and that's a whole nother factor about stuff like what is attraction or not. But because he is kind of somewhat average, he actually ends up ranking higher on the attractiveness scale, even though he's not the ugliest person in the world, and nor is he a model at all. So there's also this other kind of thing called the mere exposure effect. And that concept says that the more exposures you have to a certain group of people, the more likely you are to find that group basically attractive. And this could be something like your town. You're more likely to find people that look like the people in your town attractive. But what about your best friend? If your best friend is a little bit different, you may end up finding that because you spent so much time with your best friend that you are going to go and marry somebody somewhat similar to them, maybe some type of appearance or other attribute, just because you've been exposed to that so long. Now, there's also something to be said for if you're living with somebody, you're probably not going to find them attractive, even though you are exposed to them for an awful long time period. So you're not going to there are evolutionary factors that have come into play to help prevent you from being attracted to your sister, brother, parents, whatever. So if you are actually raised with somebody for a certain amount of time, you actually have a revulsion, and that's probably actually to prevent stuff like incest and stuff like that. But people that are down the street, that's far enough away, obviously, or good friends, you may find that you are going off and trying to date or marry someone that actually reminds you a little bit of your best friends or people from home, the girl next door, boy next door, etc. So there are additional theories as well as to why some people are more attractive than others. And one of these theories also includes this concept of perhaps that this is an overgeneralized reaction to some form of disease or simply to bad genes. So they think that these particular people may have poor genes, and thus they're not worth it to perhaps reproduce with because of the genetic factors. So somebody who's more attractive may be considered to have better genes. So that's a more evolutionary response. There's also this thing about this, basically part of this comes down to this anomalous face overgeneralization hypothesis, which basically says that we're not attractive to people who kind of look unusual, look anomalous, and or attracted to people whose faces resemble somebody who is, again, not fit enough to reproduce or not. We've already discussed a little bit about attitudes, which is that tendency to express something with some degree of favor or disfavor. Whether you like something or whether you don't really like something. And there were those two attitudes that we've mentioned, that explicit and implicit. We did mention that in one of my other lectures on consciousness and processing, but we'll repeat it here as well. Implicit are very, very strong and obvious opinions, generally speaking. So they're very, very clear that they do or do not like certain things or another. So somebody who really hates Brussels sprouts, you will be told in no uncertain terms that they don't like that. If you want to look at some of the more obvious racist things, when if people are obviously part of the Klan, obviously we can probably infer their attitudes without them really saying anything, because their behavior is pretty obvious and very explicit. They might even go off and use terms that we probably shouldn't be stating in polite company. And so that's a more implicit idea. An implicit thing is not very obvious. In fact, frequently can be very, very subtle. That doesn't mean that this attitude isn't there, but maybe these people are taking a conscious effort to not be explicit about some type of behavior. But we've got the implicit things are maybe very, very mild, that they don't think that they're letting anybody really know. So I have a friend who never would state whether she liked certain foods or not, except for olives. She really, really hated olives. But you could tell that she liked certain foods more than others because of how fast she ate them. I actually found a way to pinpoint exactly how she liked certain foods, and I told her because I was watching her eat, and she kind of freaked out. So if you don't want to freak out your friends and have them tell them you're watching them eat to find out what they liked and what they don't like, there are other ways of doing things, such as the implicit association test. We've already discussed that. That was that computer program, I think it was done through Harvard, I can't remember, where it's actually looking at how fast you're hitting certain things and how fast you're agreeing and how many mistakes you're making to figure out what your biases are. It's really kind of interesting. There's also another measurement, that's this evaluative priming task, which is how quickly a value is placed on something following something good or bad that the that is being presented to you. So basically, in this case, you have this thing. You already know that this person has an opinion on something. Maybe they like it or hate it, whatever. And you see how fast they grade. They put a value on something you present right after that. So basically what that really tells you is find out what your teachers like and make sure you give it to them right before they grade your paper. Because that could be a way to prime them to look better on your paper than they might otherwise do. So something to think about. Another section is this concept of peace and conflict and violence studies. All of this basically comes down to in-groups and out-groups. In-groups are basically us and out-groups are them, those people over there. So maybe all your people in 8 a.m. could be at one in-group as opposed to 9:30 being an out-group. It could also be men versus women, whichever one you are, transgender people versus non-transgender people, race, one race versus all the others, etc. And you can have this concept of intersectionality, which basically means you can be part of multiple in-groups, and some of those things interact in a particular way. But frequently, these people dealing with in-groups, as part of an in-group, you're frequently having issues with out-groups. Some of the worst things out there have been wars that have come down to basically in-group versus out-group, although you can make the argument all wars are basically in-group versus out-group. But there is more to that. This is in-group situations can do much more than that. Violence that isn't necessarily war. And basically what you're doing here is thinking about just basically trying to do everything possible to keep yourself the in-group. And frequently, well, maybe not always, but frequently in our history, there have been a lot of cases that this out-group has been dehumanized, such as you're looking at in a lot of genocidal situations, the out-group is considered less than human. A lot of the racial situations in the U.S., for a lot of people, for a very long time, certain groups were considered stuff like, basically animals, less than animals, subhuman, whatever, whatever the situation called for. Anything that made them seem less equal to that in-group. So when you're looking at all of this whole concepts about trying to deal with in-groups versus out-groups and this whole dehumanization situation, there are ways of reducing the dehumanization, which I'm going to get to in a second, by resolving some of the in-group, out-group issues. There can be much more peace and less conflict, and that's something that we all really want fewer wars and such like that. So how to reduce dehumanization? Basically there are three main components. The first one's individuation. See these members of your out-group as individuals and not just part of that out-group. Don't just say, the blacks or the Hispanics or the gays or whatever like that. That's not a great thing. If you get to know everybody as at least a few people, you don't need to know 20 of them, necessarily, but just knowing a few people as individuals actually helps reduce that dehumanization and make a little bit better there's much less conflict, much more harmony. Just simply seeing people as individuals. Doing situations where not really making blanket statements, regardless of which community. That also really helps that as well. Learning about other cultures, races, religion, part of education, that also, of course, is going to help, because the more you know about this other group, the less problems you may have, you may understand them more, etc. And for the love of all that is holy, stopping the spread of misinformation is probably one of the best things you can do. cut back on this whole fake news situation and show all the different groups as, positive, truthful representation. It doesn't necessarily have to be 100% perfect, but should be at least positive and truthful. And these are just how we can start reducing that humanization situation. Another situation is something like social influence, persuasion. The entire world seems like it is designed to persuade us to do one thing over another, whether that's dress a certain way, whether that's buy a certain product, whether that's get a good grade, vote for a certain candidate. There's so much stuff that persuasion is being used for. In fact, if you do work on persuasion and go into academia on that, you're probably never going to have to look for a job a day in your life, because they're all going to be trying to go after you and try to get you, because this is an area of high interest. Everyone's trying to sell people stuff, try to figure out how to influence votes a certain way, and those type of things. This is a huge deal, which is why I have a lecture coming up on that. And another one of our social influences is this whole concept of conformity. Basically, we have a desire to fit in. And here is an experiment about conformity, doing a naturalistic observation. Obviously, this wasn't in a lab setting. Want to see if this young lady will conform to strange situations.
To answer that question, we set up a hidden camera experiment to see if this woman would stand up at the sound of this tone, simply because everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this. Or would you? After just 3 beeps, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
Have a seat and they'll be out in just a couple minutes. Great, thanks so much.
Everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do? We kept the cameras rolling as more unsuspecting patients arrived. And slowly but surely, what began as a random rule for this woman has now become the social norm for everyone in this waiting room. Here to explain what's going on in their brains is Jonah Berger of the University of Pennsylvania.
This sort of internalized form of herd behavior is part of what we call social learning. Starting at a very early age, when we see members of our group perform a task, our brains literally reward us for following in their footsteps.
When I saw everybody stand up, I felt like I needed to join them. Otherwise, I'm like excluded. Once I decided to go with it, then I felt much more comfortable.
Conformity is how we become socialized, but it can also cause us to develop bad habits or repeat past wrongs.
And it's why even this rebel, who wasn't standing for any of this nonsense, eventually joined the ranks. And the only thing more shocking than seeing how easily conformity affects the way you act is that similar forces are subconsciously shaping the way you think.
And it is subconsciously changing the way we think, the way we act, obviously, and all of various other behaviors. All comes down to that conformity and desire to fit in. And this can be problematic in a variety of situations. If you're in a situation where everybody is doing drugs, maybe pressure to do the same, to blend in. As you notice what she said, I did it because everybody else was doing it. That's frequently a thing that, teenagers say, well, I did that because my friends were doing it. Oh, I did that because blankety blank was doing it. And of course, the parent response is, if all your friends jumped off a cliff, would you do the same, or jumped off a bridge? And a surprising amount of them probably would actually be doing it in that situation. But this is certainly something to think about. This also could explain why we have some really strange fashion trends that occur from time to time.
To answer
because
that
all it
question,
takes is really
we set up a hidden camera
one
experiment
random rule
to see
situation,
if this woman would
and
stand
it just
up at the sound
spreads
of this
out
tone, simply
like
because
that.
everyone else is. You might be thinking you'd never go along with this, or would you? After just 3 beeps, and without knowing why she's doing it, this woman is now conforming perfectly to the group. But what happens if we take the group away?
Elaine, please.
Okay, now she's alone. The crowd is gone and nobody is watching her, except our hidden cameras. What do you think she'll do? She's now conforming to the rules of the group without them even being there. Now, watch what happens when we introduce another outsider who doesn't know the rules.
For a noon appointment. Have a seat and they'll be out in just a couple minutes. Great, thanks so much.
Everybody was doing it, so I thought I was supposed to.
Think she'll teach the new guy what to do? We kept the cameras rolling as more unsuspecting patients arrived. And slowly but surely, what began as a random rule for this woman has now become the social norm for everyone in this waiting room. Here to explain what's going on in their brains is Jonah Berger of the University of Pennsylvania.
This sort of internalized form of herd behavior is part of what we call social learning. Starting at a very early age, when we see members of our group perform a task, our brains literally reward us for following in their footsteps.
When I saw everybody stand up, I felt like I needed to join them. Otherwise, I'm like excluded. Once I decided to go with it, then I felt much more comfortable.
Conformity is how we become socialized, but it can also cause us to develop bad habits or repeat past wrongs.
And it's why even this rebel, who wasn't standing for any of this nonsense, eventually joined the ranks. And the only thing more shocking than seeing how easily conformity affects the way you act is that similar forces are subconsciously shaping the way you think.
Another social influence is this concept of obedience. So why don't we see how people respond to authority?
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust, he set up an experiment. Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Where? Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse. Rock. House. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer. Horse.
Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Refuses to go on. The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man there. I mean, who's gonna take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one. Slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there.
A decade earlier, psychologist Stanley Milgram had also looked at how we respond to authority. In order to understand how people were induced to obey unjust regimes and participate in atrocities such as the Holocaust.
So this thing about Milgram is a very common thing that we're still kind of really discussing, really learning a lot of information about. But his information does pop up on various forms of tests as well. But this concept of how we respond to authority, it's not just civilians listening to the police. It's also situations, in the authority forces, shall we say. So there are situations where there are a lot of good cops out there, but there are also a lot of really bad ones. And there are many, many situations so far that we've especially come to light after the Black Lives Matter movement that there are a lot of police officers that are informed that they need to treat their African-American African-American people, suspects, not subjects, suspects, really, really poorly. And there are still a lot of good people out there, but a lot of them, because of that situation with authority, are end up doing really, really bad things to the suspects that they probably wouldn't otherwise do. Some of them have actually resigned due to all of this, but of course, if you take out all the good people, now we have the worst offenders that remain in that force. So things just end up getting a little bit worse. Hopefully, eventually, we'll find a way to fix things, make things better, but people have to be willing to look at situations, the authority that might not be the best idea, and say something about it if they think something is wrong, and they should be able to do this without fear of anything coming back to hurt people. There were several situations in the military about a person, a commander that ordered their squad, unit, whatever, to go commit absolute atrocities, such as there was one situation out in I think Vietnam, where it was that guy who gave all the orders, and nobody really questioned it, or at least didn't say no at that time, and they continued to participate in the atrocities. A lot of people ended up injured or killed, and even though that one of them later said, I didn't want to do this, but this is what happened, he still got prosecuted as a war criminal, because all of those just basically said stuff like, well, we were following orders. This is the reason that Nazis were also still stuff like war criminals, because they still did the stuff and didn't say maybe this is not an ideal situation. I'm sure there were other options that they could have done, the Nazis, instead of shooting the Jews, and some of them they could have been transferred to a different line of work. I'm aware that some people were requesting that because they didn't actually want to kill anybody, at least I guess not directly. It's kind of complicated, but there were always other things to do. But this is why a lot of people still get charged with stuff like war criminal, with being a war criminal. Unfortunately, the police that are committing some of these horrible atrocities are not being prosecuted like they probably should be. And that's all this comes down to, that they're responding basically just like this experiment would actually predict, because somebody else does that. And the fact is that a lot of people will respond to people in a military or police uniform, even if they are not military, not police, or not anything else like that. It's actually a very scary situation. So we got another section here, social cognition, and we're looking at stuff like heuristics, which are these mental shortcuts to make very, very quick decisions. Your brain is processing an awful lot of things at any given time, and sometimes it's just much easier if you go off and you have something built in place, because that brain is lazy. It wants to make a quick decision and not put in too much extra energy unless it has to. So two of these heuristics, I believe there are several more, but these are the two that mostly gets discussed in psychology. Is this representativeness, also sometimes called representative? Sometimes you'll see it in a couple different ways. Is saying that this individual case is more representative than it would be. So it's frequently based on stereotypes, such as if a cop thinks that African Americans are more likely to commit crime X, Y, or Z in neighborhood X, Y, or Z, whether it's true or not, they're going to primarily look at the African American suspects, then even if it's a situation where it's probably more likely to be a white person, just due to sheer numbers or whatnot. You can also make the argument, a few other arguments like that are going to come up later. You're also saying, okay, so you occasionally hear stuff like a person who wants to have an abortion. Usually the stereotype is that these are people that are just maybe that something happened. They're maybe lazy. They're poor. They deserved it, quote unquote, whatever that means, and that may not be accurate to do that. This if you want to also look at something like continuing on the abortion thing, people really think that. And this is actually probably more of an availability one, but you can make a little bit of argument for representative as well, depending on how you're framing it. But people think the third stage abortions are super, super common, and have decided, because they're so used to thinking that people who get abortions are doing this willy-nilly. A third term abortion is actually pretty rare. There's less than 3,000 worldwide. And usually it's actually due to health of the mom or the baby. It's not because people are doing something, they've just decided, oh, I don't want to have a kid right now. This is usually means that the mom or the baby is actually in danger. But people are very much thinking that it's because they have this idea of who's getting these abortions, and that's not always right. And they also think about it's more common than it would be. So that also leads into this availability heuristic as well, which basically says the immediate examples that come to mind when you're talking about one thing or another. Say abortion, a surprising amount of people actually are thinking of these later term abortions and are not realizing that most of them are actually earlier, and miscarriages are incredibly common. So those are frequently happening before the woman even knows that they're pregnant. But that can also be an example of availability. Another situation of an availability heuristic can also be that if somebody talks about, well, what's the safest form of travel? Most people are not actually going to say airplanes, because any type of airline crash tends to hit the news and it tends to blow up huge, when realistically airplanes are one of the safest ways to travel. But if they say, okay, well, will you fly or will you drive? Realistically, it's probably safer to fly than to drive because of the amount of accidents that happen. So those are another example of that. I also have a little video. If you didn't like any of my talks, or if you want to have a few more examples, we have those as well. So in case I didn't make a clear enough example, maybe this guy will help.
Every day you make decisions and judgments. Sometimes you're able to think about them carefully, but other times you make them on the fly using little information. This is where heuristics come in. Heuristics are straightforward rules of thumb that we develop based on our past experiences. They're cognitive tools that help us make quick decisions or judgments. Life would be exhausting if we had to deliberate over every one of the hundreds of choices we make every day. So instead, we use our heuristics as shortcuts to make judgments about the world around us. For example, rather than spending time deciding what to wear every day, you might have some default outfits. Or when faced with a lunch menu with too many options, you may opt for what you've enjoyed in the past. Heuristics aren't about making the perfect decision or judgment, just about making one quickly. Heuristics play a role in our reasoning about the broader world, too. As an example, consider the rate of violence in the world over the past century. Is the world more or less violent in the past 20 years than previously? Heuristic reasoning might lead us to think that the world is more violent today than it has been in the past. Every day we're confronted with images of tragedy in the news and on social media. We might reasonably assume that the world is more violent today than ever before using what's called an availability heuristic. That is, examples of violence that are so readily available, we just naturally assume the world is more violent today. But in fact, the world is more peaceful today than ever before in human history. We may hear a lot about violent events, but in terms of raw numbers, fewer people die today at the hands of other human beings than ever before. So that heuristic about how violent the world is incorrect. In fact, a slew of other heuristics can easily lead us to mistaken conclusions. And it doesn't matter how smart or well-educated you are. Anyone can place too much trust in the mental shortcuts they use to make sense of the world. Take this example. Let's say a person tests positive for a rare disease, one that only 1 in 1,000 people have. What is the likelihood that he actually has the disease? Most of us would say the likelihood is very high based on the test results alone. But what if the results were inaccurate 10% of the time? If the false positive rate is 10%, a common number in medical tests, then it is highly unlikely our patient has the disease. In fact, based on the prevalence of the disease and the test result, we can be 99% sure he doesn't have the disease. This is because the odds of getting a false positive result, 1 in 10, are much higher than the odds of actually having the disease, 1 in 1,000. But in multiple studies, physicians routinely get this wrong, overestimating the likelihood that their patient actually has the disease. Psychologists call this the representativeness heuristic. People assume an individual case is more representative than it actually is. Our political views can especially suffer from an over-reliance on heuristics. Just consider how we deal with political issues. We'll often let our political identities, and our heuristics about how right we think they are, stand in lieu of important details and information we need to have an informed viewpoint. Because our heuristics can so easily lead us to faulty conclusions, it's important to be humble about our views. In light of our fallibility, we have to do something that doesn't come easy. We must recognize that the world is an uncertain place, and that our judgments about it are often wrong. We ought to listen to opinions we may initially consider wrong or even offensive. Our intuitions are useful, even necessary when it comes to making quick judgments about the world, but that doesn't mean they're correct. Recognizing the flawed nature of your thinking is a bold first step to challenging it.
Hopefully, if you didn't understand what I was saying, hopefully that explanation was more helpful. One day I'm going to create a much better lecture, a much longer lecture about that, but
every day you make
do all of
decisions
this
and judgments.
in just an hour.
Sometimes you're able to think about them carefully, but other times you make them on the fly using little information. This is where heuristics come in. Heuristics are straightforward rules of thumb that we develop based on our past experiences. They're cognitive tools that help us make quick decisions or judgments. Life would be exhausting if we had to deliberate over every one of the hundreds of choices we make every day. So instead, we use our heuristics as shortcuts to make judgments about the world around us. For example, rather than spending time deciding what to wear every day, you might have some default outfits. Or when faced with a lunch menu with too many options, you may opt for what you've enjoyed in the past. Heuristics aren't about making the perfect decision or judgment, just about making one quickly. Heuristics play a role in our reasoning about the broader world, too. As an example, consider the rate of violence in the world over the past century. Is the world more or less violent in the past 20 years than previously? Heuristic reasoning might lead us to think that the world is more violent today than it has been in the past. Every day, we're confronted with images of tragedy in the news and on social media. We might reasonably assume that the world is more violent today than ever before using what's called an availability heuristic. That is, examples of violence that are so readily available, we just naturally assume the world is more violent today. But in fact, the world is more peaceful today than ever before in human history. We may hear a lot about violent events, but in terms of raw numbers, fewer people die today at the hands of other human beings than ever before. So that heuristic about how violent the world is incorrect. In fact, a slew of other heuristics can easily lead us to mistaken conclusions. And it doesn't matter how smart or well-educated you are. Anyone can place too much trust in the mental shortcuts they use to make sense of the world. Take this example. Let's say a person tests positive for a rare disease, one that only 1 in 1,000 people have. What is the likelihood that he actually has the disease? Most of us would say the likelihood is very high based on the test results alone. But what if the results were inaccurate 10% of the time? If the false positive rate is 10%, a common number in medical tests, then it is highly unlikely our patient has the disease. In fact, based on the prevalence of the disease and the test result, we can be 99% sure he doesn't have the disease. This is because the odds of getting a false positive result, 1 in 10, are much higher than the odds of actually having the disease, 1 in 1,000. But in multiple studies, physicians routinely get this wrong, overestimating the likelihood that their patient actually has the disease. Psychologists call this the representativeness heuristic. People assume an individual case is more representative than it actually is. Our political views can especially suffer from an over-reliance on heuristics. Just consider how we deal with political issues. We'll often let our political identities, and our heuristics about how right we think they are, stand in lieu of important details and information we need to have an informed viewpoint. Because our heuristics can so easily lead us to faulty conclusions, it's important to be humble about our views. In light of our fallibility, we have to do something that doesn't come easy. We must recognize that the world is an uncertain place, and that our judgments about it are often wrong. We ought to listen to opinions we may initially consider wrong or even offensive. Our intuitions are useful, even necessary when it comes to making quick judgments about the world, but that doesn't mean they're correct. Recognizing the flawed nature of your thinking is a bold first step to challenging it.
So here are some discussion questions. So what topics might you include in the science of social psychology? Which might you exclude? We briefly went over intersectionality, but what is it, and can you give some examples in your own life? That's another one. I didn't have time to really slide in a video about this, but it's a famous little study. But in the basement of a Stanford University building in 1971, Zimbardo simulated a prison. Participants were randomly assigned to the role of guard or of prisoner. Within a few days, participants had adopted the role so completely, guards punished and tortured prisoners, prisoners rioted, then became depressed, that the experiment had to be terminated. What conclusions were drawn? And how does this really relate to stuff like social psychology and what we just learned today? So if you guys have any questions, you guys know where to find me. Drop an email, drop a comment, whatever you think that you need to do, and I will do my best to get right back to it. Thank you guys. I'll see you guys soon.